What happens when the most powerful alpha in the kingdom makes one decision and loses everything that ever mattered? Not his throne, not his army, his family. 8 years ago, Kalen Draven stood before his court and spoke 4 words that cracked his own fate like a fault line beneath stone. He thought he was making a calculated sacrifice. He had no idea he was signing away the only thing that could have made him human. Stay with me until the very end. This one will wreck you. Drop a like and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to know where my pack is tonight. The kingdom of Shadowcrest had a particular smell before dawn. Cold iron, pine sap bleeding out of cut timber, and something older underneath, like wet ash that had been rained on 100 times but never quite washed clean. Seraphine Ashmore had memorized that smell the way a person memorizes the face of a place they know they are about to leave forever. She stood at the edge of the northern courtyard wearing her healer's sash, pale blue linen, frayed at one corner where she had caught it on a garden gate the autumn before and never gotten around to mending it. Small things like that had stopped mattering to her 3 days ago. The moment the announcement had been posted on the kingdom's sealed boards, her hands had gone quiet in a way she recognized from battlefield triage, the body conserving itself for what came next. The announcement had been brief. Official seals don't need much language to do damage. By order of His Royal Majesty Kalen Draven, Alpha King of Shadowcrest and Sovereign of the Northern Reaches, the betrothal accord between the Crown and House Ashmore is hereby dissolved. The political alliance between Shadowcrest and the Velthari Dominion requires a union of territorial consequence. His Majesty extends formal courtesy to the Ashmore family and thanks them for their service to the realm. Formal courtesy. Seraphine had read those 2 words 4 times, standing in the corridor outside the council annex with the parchment still warm from the wax seal. Then she had folded it in half, pressed it flat against her thigh, and walked back to the healer's wing without speaking to anyone. That had been 3 days ago. Tonight was the night of the formal court ceremony, the public announcement of the new betrothal to Lady Mira Velthari, second daughter of the Dominion's ruling house, a woman Seraphine had never met and bore no anger toward. The anger she felt had a single, precise address. The courtyard torches threw long shadows across the flagstones. Inside the great hall, she could hear the low thrum of assembled nobles, the particular frequency of a crowd dressed in its finest and performing contentment. Music. Crystal striking crystal, the soft, relentless machinery of power conducting itself on schedule. She should have already been gone. She had planned to be. Her pack, 2 saddlebags and a locked wooden case containing her healer's instruments, sat inside the stable with a hired horse whose owner asked no questions because Seraphine had paid him not to ask any. The road north opened up a mile past the river crossing. She knew every landmark on it. She had spent 2 nights memorizing a route that curved well clear of all the checkpoints that would be active once the ceremony ended, and the kingdom sealed itself around its new political arrangement. But she had not yet left, and standing in the courtyard, she understood why. She was waiting to see if he would come. He did not come. The great hall doors opened once, a rush of warm light and string music, and a pair of junior aides stepped out to argue about seating arrangements in urgent whispers. Neither of them noticed her. She was very good at not being noticed when she needed to be. It was, in a brutal kind of way, the most useful skill her station had ever taught her. She pressed her palm flat against the stone column at her back and felt the cold move through the linen into her skin. She breathed through it. 4 weeks ago, she had confirmed what she already suspected, visiting a healer 3 territories over and paying an unmarked coin for discretion rather than documentation. 2 heartbeats where there should have been one. A warmth in her abdomen that hadn't been there before. Specific and insistent, like a secret that intended to keep itself whether she cooperated or not. She had not told him. She had intended to. She had practiced the words during 7 separate sleepless hours across 4 different nights. She had imagined his face. She had imagined, and this was the thing she would spend years never forgiving herself for imagining, that it would matter, that it would change the calculation, that the Alpha King of Shadowcrest, who had been in her company nearly every evening for 6 months, who had watched her set the broken wrist of his best commander and then spent 2 hours afterward asking her questions about bone architecture just to hear her talk, That this man would hear two heartbeats where there should be one and find a way to choose differently. She had been wrong, not because he was cruel, because she had fundamentally misunderstood what she meant to him. She was a healer's daughter from a mid-tier noble house. She was useful. She was comfortable. She was present at a time when he had needed someone in his orbit who did not want something from him the way the court wanted things, with both hands open and the eyes already calculating what else might be taken. She had not understood that this made her peripheral, not essential. There was a difference, and she had learned it from a parchment with a wax seal while standing in a corridor that smelled like tallow smoke. She pushed off from the column. The stable was at the far end of the north service path, past the kitchen gardens and the groundskeeper's shed. She knew the route well enough to walk it without a torch. She was almost to the garden gate when she heard the voice. Seraphine. She stopped. She did not turn around immediately. She gave herself 3 full seconds. She counted them, the way she had learned to count in crisis, giving her hands something precise to do. And then she turned. Kalen Draven stood 10 feet behind her in the darkness between 2 torch posts, wearing his formal court attire under an undone outer coat, the silver chain of his rank across his chest catching the distant light from the hall windows. He was 6'3" and built like someone who had spent the first 20 years of his life learning to occupy space rather than apologize for it. His jaw was set in the way she had come to recognize meant he was managing something he did not know how to say. He looked like a man who had run out of the ceremony to find her. His hair was not quite right for a public event. She noted that and felt nothing in particular about it. You were leaving, he said. It was not a question. Yes. He stopped, recalibrated. I had intended to speak with you before tonight. Council sessions went long, and the Volthari delegation required. Kalen. Her voice came out flat and steady. She was grateful for that. I don't need an explanation of your schedule. He moved closer. She held her ground, which cost her more than she showed. I need you to understand this wasn't something I chose carelessly. The alliance with the Dominion secures the northern border. Without it, we face another season of raids. The council, she said quietly, told you that you needed a politically significant mate, and you agreed with them. That's the whole of it. It's not that simple. I know it isn't. I know what the northern border situation looks like. I've treated enough men from those raids to understand the math. She kept her hands still at her sides. I'm not angry about the border. I'm not angry about the alliance. I'm not even angry about Lady Volthari. He watched her with the focused attention she had always found difficult to receive, the kind that was not actually seeing her but was trying to, and not quite getting there. Then what are you angry about? I'm angry that you decided, she said. You looked at everything and you made a decision, and you did not consider that I might have had a right to be part of that conversation. You announced it publicly. You told me with a wax seal. The muscle in his jaw moved. I know. That was wrong. Yes. Seraphine, He put his hand out toward her, not quite touching, hovering in the air between them. Don't go tonight. Stay. We'll find a way to what? She said it without heat, which made it land harder. To make me the unofficial Luna? The court's open secret? I treat soldiers, Kalen. I know what that arrangement costs the woman and what it costs the children she has in it. He went very still. She watched his face, and she made herself look at it the way she had learned to look at wounds, directly, without flinching. He was not going to fight for her. She had known that already, but knowing a thing and watching its confirmation move across a person's face were different weights. I care about you, he said. I know you do. That matters. It does. She reached down and picked up her bag from where she had set it against the gatepost. Caring about someone doesn't make them your priority. You have a kingdom. You made a choice that served your kingdom. That is what kings do, and I think, she pulled the strap over her shoulder, that I always understood that better than I let myself believe. Where will you go? Away. That's not... Seraphine, I can't just let you walk out of here without knowing you're safe. She looked at him for a long moment. The torchlight from the hall was gold and remote. Inside, she could hear the string music shift into a formal processional. the ceremony's first major transition. He had only a few minutes before his absence would be noted. "I'll be safe," she said. "I'm very good at taking care of myself." She did not tell him that she was also going to need to become very good at taking care of two. She sealed that information somewhere behind her sternum and kept her face level and her breathing even, and she watched him understand slowly that she was not going to beg him, was not going to break down in a way that would give him a crisis he could manage, and thereby feel useful and thereby feel absolved. He stood in the torchless gap between the light posts, and she could see it cost him something, that she was leaving this cleanly, that he had expected grief and was instead receiving only departure. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know you are," she said. "Good night, Kaylin." She turned. She walked through the garden gate, down the service path, through the dark between the kitchen gardens and the groundskeeper's shed, and into the stable where the horse was waiting with no name on the bill and no one who would be asked about it. She did not cry until she was past the river crossing, alone on the north road with nothing in any direction but cold air and dark timber and the particular silence of a world that would not be mourning with her. Then she let herself have 10 minutes. She counted those too. Then she rode. The mountain territory of Ashenvale was not a destination she had chosen so much as discovered. The road north had branches, and she had taken the ones that climbed rather than descended, following some instinct she could not articulate beyond the understanding that high ground was harder to track and that no one from the Shadowcrest court would think to look for a healer who was comfortable in altitude. She found Ashenvale in the third week of travel, half delirious from the thin mountain air and the particular nausea that came with the early weeks of carrying. It was a territory of perhaps 400 souls spread across 3 villages built into the rock faces above a fast river. It had no alpha. The pack that had governed it had fractured and dispersed 2 generations back over a territory dispute that no one had fully resolved, and most had simply stopped pressing. The people there were wary and self-sufficient and deeply uninterested in anyone who might represent outside authority. They were ideal. She introduced herself with her skills rather than her name. The first family she treated, a man with a badly infected leg wound that would have cost him the limb inside a week, spread word the way practical gratitude does, which is to say, efficiently and without flourish. She had patience before she had shelter, and shelter before she had a proper name registered in the village records, and by the time anyone thought to ask too carefully where she had come from, she had been there long enough that the answer mattered less than whether she would stay. She stayed. She built a life the way you build something in wind, one secured element at a time, making sure each piece could bear weight before adding the next. She chose the name Marin for daily use. Her patients called her healer Marin, and then eventually just Marin, and then, among the older women of the second village, simply the healer, which was as close to a title as the territory offered and suited her considerably better than Luna Apparent of Shadowcrest had ever suited her skin. The twins came in the 7th month of her time in Ashenvale, which was also the dead of winter, which meant no one could easily travel in or out, and she had only the midwife and the neighbor woman to help her, and she was grateful for the isolation, even in the worst hours of it, because it meant no one would see her face when the midwife laid the second one, the girl, across her chest, and Seraphine looked down at 2 perfect strangers who were also, unmistakably, exactly half of the man she had left. Rowan had his jaw even at 3 days old, the set of it, that faint stubbornness already written into cartilage and bone. She traced it with her thumb and made herself commit to a practical thought. She would need more willow bark by spring. She was running low. The eastern ridge had a stand of it past the second stream crossing. Lyra had his eyes. Seraphine took longer to reconcile herself to that. She reconciled herself to it. That was the nature of the work ahead of her, taking the things that could have broken her and processing them the way her body processed cold, which was not by eliminating the discomfort, but by continuing to function in the presence of it. She raised them. The years went by in the way that years do, when you are too occupied to count them in real time and only notice their accumulation in retrospect. Rowan learned to walk and then to run and then to climb the rock faces above the second village with a confidence that made the older wolves murmur appreciatively. Lyra developed a stillness, a quality of attention, that Seraphine recognized from her own methodology, the learned ability to take in a situation more completely before acting than most people thought to do. They were good children. They were also, increasingly, children who drew attention. At 5, Rowan had shifted for the first time, nearly a year and a half before any child in the territory's memory had managed it. The shift had been involuntary, triggered by Lyra getting her hand caught in a fence gate, and the wolf that emerged from Rowan's 5-year-old frame had been larger than made developmental sense, gray as mountain slate, with eyes the color of deep winter ice. He had stood between the fence gate and his sister with his forepaws planted and his hackles raised, and the nearest 3 adults had all taken a collective step back before remembering that this was Marin's son. Lyra shifted 3 months later, deliberately. She sat down cross-legged in the healer's garden, went very quiet for approximately 90 seconds, and became a wolf with dark auburn fur and the previously mentioned eyes. The alpha's eyes, silver pale and specific, which was something Seraphine kept tightly contained behind a careful expression when the village elder mentioned how unusual the coloring was. Their father's side, she said, remote northern bloodline, strong traits. The elder had accepted this because the elder was a pragmatic woman who had stopped expecting clean explanations from the healer years ago and had decided the healer's competence was worth more than her transparency. But the children grew, and children with abilities like Rowan's and Lyra's could not be kept permanently small. Boy, it was Rowan who came to her first. The autumn they both turned 7. He had the particular directness of a child who had decided to treat a thing as practical rather than emotional because he had observed that this approach worked on his mother. He sat across the workbench from her while she was sorting dried herbs into the small clay jars she used for the winter stores. His elbows were on the bench and his chin was in his hands, which was his thinking posture. "Is our father dead?" he said. Her hands did not stop moving. "What makes you ask that?" "Because everyone here has a father except Lyra and me, and I want to know if it's because he died or because he left. Because those are different." "They are different," she agreed. "Which one is ours?" She considered her options. Rowan was 7 years old and very serious, and the look on his face was the look she had seen on his face when he had set the broken leg of an injured deer they found above the 3rd ridge, careful and committed and braced for difficulty. She had not raised him to be lied to. "He's alive," she said. "He didn't leave in the way you mean. We left him." "I did." "Why?" "Because we needed a different life than the one we would have had near him." Rowan absorbed this. His brow did the thing it did when he was working through a problem. A slight furrow, very like his father's, which Seraphine had observed and never commented on. "Is he bad?" "No," she said after a moment. "He made a bad choice. Those aren't always the same thing." "Did he know about us?" "No." "Does he know now?" "No." Rowan was quiet for a long beat. He picked up one of the small clay jars and turned it in his hands without opening it. "If he knew," he said slowly, "do you think he'd come?" Seraphine set down the bunch of dried rosemary she was holding and looked at her son squarely. His eyes were hers, dark brown, warm, capable of considerable watchfulness. And in this particular moment, they were doing something very careful and very attentive. "I don't know," she said honestly. He nodded. He set the jar down. "Okay," he said, and went back outside. She sat with the herbs for a while after he left, not sorting anything. The autumn light came through the shutters at the angle it took this time of year, long and reddish, turning the dust in the air into something that almost looked intentional. She thought, not for the first time and not for the last, about the difference between a secret and a wound. Secrets could be managed. You built the correct walls around them and maintained those walls, and the secret stayed put. Wounds were different. Wounds had an agenda of their own. They healed on their own schedule or they didn't heal at all, and the distinguishing feature was usually whether they had been properly cleaned at the start. She had never properly cleaned this one. She recognized that. She did not yet know what to do about the recognition, so she filed it in the category of things she was aware of and managing, which was a category that had served her adequately for 8 years, and showed, at this point, its first real signs of structural strain. The spring they turned 8, the rumors arrived before the men did. A trader came through in late thaw, a circuit man who moved goods between the mountain territories and sold information as a secondary currency, and mentioned over the table at the Common House that there was Royal Crown activity in the Eastern Territories. Not military, investigative. Scouts without insignia, but with the bearing of palace-trained men asking questions about unregistered pack bloodlines and gifted young wolves. Seraphine heard this secondhand from the village elder, who told her because the elder had long since concluded that information relevant to Marin's children was information Marin would want quickly. They're asking about abilities, the elder said. Specific ones. Early shifting, enhanced range, dual trait inheritance. Seraphine set down her tea. Where east? Pelrath territory, 3 days' ride. The elder looked at her without pretending not to look at her. Marin, I know. If there's something you've been managing quietly that's about to become unquiet, I know, she said again, more gently. Let me think. She thought for 4 days. She thought while she was treating patients, and while she was cooking, and while she was lying awake past midnight with the shutters open and the mountain cold coming in clean and sharp and clarifying. She thought about the walls she had built and the walls she had maintained and the particular structural truth of walls, which was that they were useful as long as what they contained was smaller than what they protected against. She had raised children who were becoming larger than any wall she could build around them, not in a way that was their failing, in a way that was simply physics. On the 4th day, she sat Rowan and Lyra down at the kitchen table after supper. Rowan sat the way he always sat, upright, both forearms on the table, present. Lyra had her legs folded underneath her on the bench, which she had been told approximately 40 times was not what benches were for, and she had the expression she got when she understood that something important was being prepared and she was deciding whether to be afraid of it. I need to tell you something about where we came from, Seraphine said. Rowan said nothing. Lyra uncurled her legs and put them on the floor, which was, Seraphine recognized, the most serious signal her daughter had available. Your father is a king, Seraphine said. The kitchen was quiet. The fire in the cook stove ticked and settled. Which king? Rowan said, very carefully. Kaelin Draven, Alpha King of Shadowcrest. Lyra's face went through something complicated that resolved into the particular stillness she used when she was doing her most serious thinking. Rowan's did not change at all, which was its own kind of telling. He doesn't know we exist, Seraphine continued. I left before you were born. I had reasons. I still believe those reasons were right, but there are men in the Eastern Territories asking questions about young wolves with unusual abilities, and I need you both to understand the shape of our situation fully now, because we might need to run again, Lyra said. Not a question. Flat and practical, the way she handled things she had already categorized. Possibly. Or I may be wrong about what the scouts are looking for, and we'll have months yet. I don't know. Are you scared? Rowan asked. She looked at her son, 8 years old with his father's jaw and her judgment and something else, something that was neither of them, that was purely his own, built in the space between two inherited natures. Yes, she said. That's not the useful question. What's the useful question? What do we do next? Rowan put both his palms flat on the table, the way he did when he was committing to a course of action. Lyra reached across and put her hand over one of his, and the two of them looked at their mother with a shared expression that had no template in anything Seraphine had experienced before. It was the look of two people who were deciding together, in real time, how large their own courage was. Okay, Rowan said. Then what do we do next? She opened her mouth to answer. The door of the house came off its hinges. Not knocked, not opened hard. Removed, frame and all, by a force that had been applied from the outside with precision rather than violence, which was in some ways worse. 3 men came through the gap in trained formation, the kind that spoke of years of coordinated movement rather than improvised action, and the 4th came through last, moving differently than the others, slower, more controlled, the cadence of someone who had learned long ago that speed was a resource and not a reflex. He was taller than the doorframe required him to duck for. He wore a travel coat dark with dust and the dark of recent hard riding. His hair was longer than it had been 8 years ago. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that had not been there before, and his eyes themselves, silver pale, specific, winter ice, were already moving past the men and past the kitchen's sparse furnishings and finding her. Then they moved, with the involuntary precision of something magnetic and structural and entirely out of his control, to the two children at the table. The children who had his jaw, his eyes, his coloring in one case and not the other, and his particular specific quality of presence that she had never been able to name and had never stopped recognizing. Kaelin Draven stood in the wreckage of her door and looked at the family he did not know he had. And the sound that came out of him was not royal and was not controlled and was not the sound of an alpha king. It was something older than titles, something that had been sealed behind 8 years of not knowing what it was sealed behind. Rowan was on his feet. His chair hit the floor behind him. He was positioned between his mother and the men at the door, with both his hands at his sides and his wolf rising through his skin in a shimmer of gray. And his voice, when he spoke, was 8 years old and also something considerably more ancient. "Get away from my mother." The gray wolf shimmer across Rowan's skin did not recede. It held there, visible at the edges of him, the way heat holds above stone in summer, not quite breaking through but making the air around him different. He was 8 years old and standing in the defensive formation Seraphine had never taught him, which meant he had arrived at it the same way he arrived at most things, by logic rather than instruction. Kaelin had not moved past the doorframe. This was what Seraphine noticed first. Not the men he had brought, not the wreckage of her threshold, not even his face, which was doing something she had no clean category for. She noticed that he had stopped, that whatever he had expected to find at the end of 8 years of absence, it had not been this, and the discovery had stopped him the way a physical obstacle stops movement rather than the way a decision does. The men behind him held their positions. Trained stillness. They were watching Rowan with the careful assessment of people who have been told to expect ordinary and have found something else. Lyra had not moved from the bench. She was watching Kaelin with her silver pale eyes and her hands flat on her thighs, and the expression she used when she was categorizing something completely before deciding what it required of her. Seraphine stood up from the table. Slowly. She kept her hands visible and her voice below the register that would escalate anything. "Rowan," she said. "No," he said without looking at her. His eyes were fixed on Kaelin. Not until they stepped back. "Rowan." "He broke our door, Mom." Kaelin's chest moved on a breath. He looked at the boy. Really looked, the way Seraphine had seen him look at things he was trying to measure accurately. And something in his face shifted, tightened, then went carefully blank in the way that powerful men's faces go blank, when they are managing something too large to process publicly. "Step back," he said to his men. Quiet. Absolute. The 3 trained men stepped back through the empty frame without hesitation. Kaelin did not move himself, but the space between him and the table widened by that distance, and Rowan's shimmer settled fractionally, still present but no longer building. "You broke my door," Seraphine said. His eyes moved to her. "I didn't know if you'd open it." "So you removed it?" "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment. 8 years had done the specific work they do on a face that carries authority and uses it constantly. The lines were deeper, the set of his jaw more settled into itself, the gray at his temples which had not been there before. He looked like a man who had been making hard choices for a long time and had gotten very competent at it without getting any more comfortable. "How did you find us?" she said. Slowly. He said it without evasion, which she noted. "And badly, for most of it. I've been looking for 2 years." "Why?" The word landed in the kitchen and sat there. Lyra's head tilted 2 degrees, which was her tell for heightened attention. Rowan had not moved, but the shimmer was fully gone now, and he was standing like a boy again rather than a perimeter. Kaelin looked at her and then, deliberately, at the 2 children at the table, and back at her. The calculation was visible. Not the cold calculation of a man who has made his decision and is managing the room, but the raw calculation of a man who is understanding something in real time and trying to find solid footing on new ground. "Because I was wrong," he said, "about what happened the night you left, about why you left, about—" He stopped. The muscle in his jaw worked. "I didn't know." "About them," she said flatly. "About any of it." Rowan said, "You're the king." Everyone looked at him. He had said it without particular emotion, the same tone he used for establishing facts before building an argument. Kaylin looked at the boy. Yes? My mother told us about you, tonight, right before you broke our door. A flicker of something crossed Kaylin's face, not quite pain, more like a man pressing on a bruise to confirm its edges. What did she tell you? That you made a bad choice, Rowan said, and that those aren't always the same as being bad. The kitchen held that. Seraphine watched Kaylin absorb it, and she felt something she had not felt in 8 years, which was the particular vulnerability of being fairly seen by someone. She had told her son the most honest thing she knew, and her son had repeated it back in the direction of the man it was about, and there was nothing left to manage about that. It had simply occurred. No, Kaylin said quietly. They're not always the same. But sometimes they are, Lyra said from the bench, her first words since he'd entered. She had not changed her posture. Her voice was even and direct and carried none of Rowan's confrontational edge. Something more precise than that, more clinical. Are you here because you figured out what you did wrong, or because you found out we exist? The silence that followed was the longest one yet. Seraphine did not fill it. She wanted to see what he would do with it. Kaylin looked at her daughter for a measured moment. The silver pale of Lyra's eyes was his, exactly. And this was apparently something he had not yet finished processing, because there was a fraction of a second where his composure actually broke before he rebuilt it. Both, he said, in that order. Lyra considered this. Then she looked at her mother. Seraphine said, Go to Hessa's house. Take the side path. Take your coats. Mom, this is not a debate, Lyra. Lyra unfolded from the bench. She looked at Kaylin once more, a look that was assessing and direct and entirely without deference, and then she moved toward the back of the house. Rowan followed her, but he stopped in the kitchen doorway and turned. If you make her cry, he said to Kaylin, without raising his voice, I'll know. He left. His footsteps went through the back passage, and the soft close of the rear door was the only sound for several seconds. Kaylin let out a breath. It was not a steady breath. He's 8, he said. It was not a question. It was the sound of a man confronting arithmetic. 8 years, 4 months. Seraphine moved to the cook stove and did the practical thing, which was to put the kettle on because her hands needed an occupation, and the ritual of ordinary things was the only way she knew to keep the temperature of a room from climbing past usefulness. Sit down if you're going to stay, and tell your men to stand down. We're not running. Sarah, don't. She said it without turning around. Don't use that name yet. You haven't earned the shorthand. A pause. Then the sound of a chair being pulled from the table. She heard him sit down. She heard him put both hands flat on the table surface, which was something he did. She had forgotten she knew that about him, and remembering it now was a small, specific cruelty. She waited for the kettle. The conspiracy, he said, against the alliance, against the Velthari arrangement. I found the evidence 18 months after you left. It was orchestrated by Councillor Vane and 2 of his allies. They manipulated the territorial reports to make the Velthari alliance look like the only option. They wanted the Luna's chair empty for a candidate they controlled. She said nothing. The Velthari betrothal was dissolved 14 months ago. Lady Mira returned to the Dominion with full honor. She had no part in it, and she knew the arrangement was political from the start. She wished me luck finding who I was actually looking for. He paused. Those were her words. Seraphine poured the water. She set the kettle down. She turned around and put both cups on the table and sat across from him because standing felt like a performance of strength she was not interested in sustaining. She looked at him directly. He looked back. He looked worse up close. Not older in a way that was only time, but older in the way of a man who has not been sleeping easily, whose jaw carries the tension of an ongoing problem rather than a concluded one. You spent 2 years finding us, she said. Yes. Why not let it go? You had a kingdom to run. Because I have a kingdom with a rotten foundation, he said, and I spent 8 years not understanding why everything I built on it kept failing. The nobles I trusted were the ones who had orchestrated the whole thing. Vane and his faction had their hands in the treasury records, the border reports, the succession arrangements. When I finally found it, I found all of it, and I found He stopped. His hands moved on the table. I found evidence of what night you left. The report I was never given. The message you sent me 3 days before the announcement that was intercepted and destroyed. She went still. You wrote to me, he said, carefully, watching her face. Before the announcement, you wrote to ask if there was something we needed to discuss privately. It was intercepted by Vane's man in the courier rotation. I never received it. The kitchen was very quiet. The fire in the cook stove ticked. Seraphine felt the architecture of the last 8 years conduct a rapid self-examination and found that several of its load-bearing walls had been built on a premise that was not entirely accurate. She had told herself, on the bad nights, and there had been many of them in the early years especially, that she had been a fool to wait, that she should have gone to him directly rather than sending a message, that his failure to respond had confirmed what she already suspected, that she had been correct to leave before a conversation occurred that would have left her with less dignity than the one she'd had by the garden gate. She had not told herself that the message had never reached him. She had not known that was a possibility she needed to account for. The message wouldn't have changed the announcement, she said. Her voice was even. She was very good at even. The alliance was already signed. No, he said. It wasn't. The signing was scheduled for 3 days after the announcement. The announcement was... He pressed his fingers flat against the table surface. A deliberate gesture, a man making himself stay measured. Vane pushed for the public announcement first because he understood that once it was public, your position became politically untenable. He wanted you removed before I had the private conversation that might have changed my thinking. She sat with that. She had spent 8 years constructing a very specific understanding of what had happened, and that understanding had been load-bearing. It had been the thing she stood on when the bad nights came. The fact of his choice, made with full information, made without her. It had been the reason leaving was right. It had been the architecture she had built her subsequent life on. It was not gone. It did not disappear because the message had been intercepted. He had still made the announcement. He had still stood in that courtyard and told her the kingdom required a different arrangement. He had still let her walk to the stable. But the shape of the last 8 years had shifted by some degrees that she had not yet finished measuring, and she needed time to measure them before she said anything that was not reversible. This doesn't... She stopped, restarted. What happened to you happened to me too, in the sense that we were both operated on by people who wanted a specific outcome. That's true. It doesn't erase what the outcome was. I know that. 8 years, Kaylin. I know. You don't know, she said, and her voice came out with a different texture than she had intended, something raw underneath the even. You know the number. You don't know what 8 years with 2 infants in a mountain territory feels like when your wolf is compromised from the birth and you can't shift for 6 months and there's no pack around you and the children are sick in the second winter and you're entirely alone in the most specific way a person can be alone. She stopped. She breathed. You can know the number. You don't get to know that. He didn't move. He didn't try to answer it. He looked at her with the full, undivided weight of his attention, and he did not offer anything. Not an apology that would be insufficient, not a defense, not a reframing. He took it in the way she had said it and let it sit. She had not expected that. It cost her something, that he had learned to do that. What do you want? She said, specifically, from this conversation. I want to fix what I broke. You can't fix 8 years. No, he said, but I can fix what's coming. There are men in the Eastern Territories, Seraphine, not just scouts. Vane still has faction allies who weren't caught in the first round of exposure, and they know I've been looking for something valuable, and they've been following my search. I found you. His jaw tightened. I found you 3 days ago. They found you a day after that. The back of her neck went cold. The men outside, she said. Mine. I brought 6. I'm not certain how many are theirs, but the road south of Ashenvale has been watched since yesterday morning. He looked at her steadily. Your children are extraordinary, Seraphine, even at a distance. The scouts who've been tracking gifted young wolves, 3 of them are Vane's people, not mine. They've been building a case for the existence of royal heirs outside the succession line, heirs they could use or eliminate depending on which was more useful. She was already standing, She did not remember deciding to stand, but she was standing, both hands on the table's edge, her healer's brain doing triage in real time on a problem that was no longer theoretical. Hessa's house, she said, the side path from the back. Already covered. I put 2 men on the north perimeter when we arrived. You assumed I'd send them there? I assumed you'd send them somewhere safe. The perimeter is covered in all directions. He stood too, and the height of him in her low-ceilinged kitchen was the same specific disruption it had always been. Not intimidating, just present, the way large things in small spaces are present. I need you to trust me for the next 12 hours. Not completely, not permanently, just enough to let me get you and the children to a position I can defend. And then what? And then we have the rest of the conversation. She looked at him. The firelight was low and his face was close to the edge of it, half lit, and she could see the exhaustion in him and the steadiness underneath the exhaustion, the quality of a man who had decided something clearly and was holding to it past the point where holding became difficult. She heard it then, what she should have heard 3 seconds earlier, what her threat-reading instincts had been trying to surface through the noise of the conversation. A sound from the north side of the house, not the wind, a displacement of gravel, specific and weighted, and then the short, choked silence that meant one of Kaylin's perimeter men had been removed without getting a sound out. Kaylin had heard it too. He was already moving, putting himself between her and the door, his wolf rising through his skin with the controlled precision of a man who had been at war and knew exactly what this particular silence meant. They're inside the perimeter, he said. Quiet. Flat. We have maybe 90 seconds. She looked at him. Her children were 200 yards away through the dark at Hessa's house, with 2 of his men between them and a faction that wanted them used or eliminated depending on convenience. She made the only decision available. Move, she said. Now. They went out the back. Seraphine grabbed her coat from the hook by the rear passage and her locked case from beneath the workbench. Reflex, not thought. 8 years of contingency planning expressing itself in the 2 seconds between decision and movement. Kaylin was already at the back door, one hand braced on the frame, reading the dark outside with the particular stillness of a man whose wolf was doing the work his eyes couldn't. Clear, he said. 30 seconds, maybe less. They moved. The path to Hessa's house ran northeast through a stand of birch that had been there longer than the village, trunks pale and close together, the ground beneath them packed hard from years of foot traffic. Seraphine knew every route on it. She ran it in the dark without slowing, and Kaylin ran beside her, not ahead, which she noted without comment. He had positioned himself on her exposed side between her and the direction the sound had come from. The birch stand opened into a clearing, and Hessa's house sat at the far edge of it, a low stone structure with a light in the single front window. 2 of Kaylin's men were visible at the tree line, and then they were running too, toward the house, because they had heard the same silence from the perimeter that Kaylin had heard. Seraphine hit the door of Hessa's house, already calling. Rowan! Lyra! They were in the front room. Rowan had placed himself between the window and Lyra with the automatic geometry she was beginning to understand he would always default to. Hessa, a broad-shouldered woman of 60 who had delivered half the village's children and maintained her composure through incidents that would have unmade a lesser person, looked at Seraphine's face and stood up without being asked. How many are coming? Hessa said. Unknown, Kaylin said, coming through the door behind Seraphine. He looked at his 2 men. Report. North perimeter is down. Davith isn't responding. The taller of the 2 men kept his voice flat and professional. Movement in the eastern tree line. At least 4 contacts. They're holding position. Holding means they're waiting for something, Kaylin said. Waiting for what? Seraphine said. He didn't answer immediately. He was looking at the window, at the dark tree line beyond the clearing, and she watched him run a calculation behind his eyes that she didn't have all the variables for. The 4 contacts in the eastern tree line. 1 man down at the north perimeter. The faction following his search trail. They're waiting for the rest of their people, he said slowly. This isn't an extraction. This is a containment. The word landed with specific weight, not grab and run, surround and hold, which meant they had time, a narrow window of it, before the rest of the faction's people closed the perimeter. There's a way out, Seraphine said. She was already thinking the terrain, mapping it the way she'd mapped it 100 times in the 8 years she'd been here. The river path. West side. It goes below the ridge line. You can't see it from the eastern tree line or from the road south. How long to the river? 8 minutes at a walk, 4 running. Is there cover? Full cover until the river bend. After that, it opens up for maybe 50 yards before the next ridge. Kalen looked at his men. Take the family. River path, west side. I'll draw their attention from the front. No, Seraphine said. He looked at her. You're not drawing their attention from the front, she said. You're 6'3" and you're the only reason they're here. If they see you go north, they'll split and we'll lose half our lead time. She looked at his men. How many did you bring total? 6, the tall one said. Where are the other 4? 2 on the south road, 2 were north perimeter. One's down, one's unaccounted for. She processed this. South road covered, north perimeter compromised, east tree line holding with at least 4 contacts. West was the only direction that hadn't been addressed, which either meant they hadn't thought of the river path, or they had and were planning to close it last. We all go, she said, now, before they close the west. Kalen held for 1 second, the second of a man accustomed to directing rather than deferring, and then he moved. She recognized the specific quality of that movement. He had decided she was right and had dispensed with the friction of ego around the fact. She filed that away without deciding what to do with it. They went out the rear of Hessa's house into the dark. Rowan ran without being told to run. Lyra was beside him, her stride measured, her breathing controlled with the deliberateness of a child who had understood the situation from the moment Kalen's men took their positions in the clearing. Hessa came with them. Seraphine had not asked her to, and had not told her not to, and the old woman moved through the dark birch stand with the economy of someone who has been navigating difficult terrain their entire life, and has no patience for panic. The river path opened below the ridge exactly as Seraphine knew it would. The sound of the water came up before the path itself was visible, and she felt something loosen slightly in her chest at the sound. The particular relief of familiar ground in a crisis, the way the body eases when it recognizes where it is. They were 50 yards down the path when Rowan stopped. He stopped so completely and so suddenly that Lyra almost ran into him, catching herself with a hand on his shoulder. He was facing east, away from the river, into the dark between the ridge and the birch stand behind them. Rowan, Seraphine said. There's someone on the path ahead, he said. Kalen was already past them both, moving forward, and then he stopped too. His wolf was fully present now, not shimmering, but solid. The change had come quietly, without drama, the way natural things do when they're not performed. In the dark, he was considerably larger than he'd been in her kitchen, and the 2 men with him fanned automatically to his flanks. The figure on the path ahead resolved as they closed the distance. Torchlight from somewhere along the river bend threw just enough light to make out the shape. A man, standing still, facing them. Not running, not hiding. Standing with the deliberate stillness of someone who had been waiting. Seraphine recognized the posture before she recognized the face. Commander Aldrich. Kalen's second. The man who had been with him for 12 years. The name she had heard more times than any other in the 2 years of Kalen's court life she had occupied. The man whose broken wrist she had set in the palace healer's wing while Kalen watched and asked her questions about bone architecture just to hear her talk. He was standing on the river path in Ashenvale with his hands at his sides and his sword sheathed, which was either a gesture of neutrality or the posture of a man who did not need a sword for what he had come to do. Aldrich, Kalen said. 1 word, flat and careful. My lord. His voice was the same, measured, formal, the voice of a man who had spent a decade making difficult things sound orderly. I tried to find a cleaner way to do this. The silence that followed was the silence of the ground dropping out from beneath a structure. Seraphine felt it in her sternum, the specific register of a betrayal being confirmed rather than suspected. Kalen had gone very still beside her, not the stillness of a man in control. The stillness of a man absorbing a blow that had reached somewhere the armor didn't cover. How long? Kalen said. 3 years, since the second Treasury audit. Aldrich's voice carried no pleasure in this. He sounded like a man doing a thing he had committed to and was honoring the commitment without enjoying it. Vane's people approached me after you dismissed 3 of his faction from the council. They needed someone close to you who could manage the search. Specifically, manage where it went and how fast. You've been running my search. Redirecting it. There's a difference. A pause. You were going to find her eventually regardless. I slowed it by 14 months. Kaylin's breathing had changed. Seraphine heard it. The specific alteration of a man whose wolf is in direct conflict with his human cognition, the body wanting to act while the mind is still processing what action would even mean here. 12 years. The arithmetic of it was doing its own kind of violence in real time, and she understood, watching him, that some of the load-bearing structures of his own life were conducting the same rapid self-examination hers had undergone in the kitchen an hour ago. The North Perimeter man, Kaylin said. Davith. Alive. Sedated. Aldrich's chin moved slightly. I'm not here to hurt anyone. I'm here because the faction's position has changed. They no longer need the children eliminated. Then what do they need? Seraphine said. Aldrich looked at her. She had the impression he had been hoping she would stay quiet, and she had the further impression that he had known before he finished the hope that she would not. They need the children presented to the successor council as legitimate heirs, he said. Publicly, under the faction's sponsorship, which means the king acknowledges the heirs under terms the faction controls, or what? Kaylin said. Or the faction releases documentation to the Dominion and to the 3 rival Alpha territories that the Crown has been concealing a succession line for 8 years, which is technically true. Aldrich's voice had developed a quality she recognized from the kitchen earlier when Kaylin had been managing something too large to show. The documentation is already prepared. It doesn't require context to be damaging. But Seraphine understood the architecture of the threat immediately, the way she understood the architecture of a physical wound, where the damage was, where the bleeding was, how much time there was to work with. The documentation didn't need to be accurate to be effective. It only needed to exist and be released to the right recipients at the right moment. The rival territories would not wait for context before acting on the perception that Shadowcrest's succession was unstable. The Dominion had a dissolved betrothal and a former Lady Velthari who had been treated with honor but had nonetheless been returned. They would need very little additional provocation to read instability as opportunity. Kaylin was looking at Aldrich with a specific expression she had not seen on his face before. It took her a moment to identify it because it was not an expression she associated with him. It was the expression of a man encountering the precise limit of the protection he had believed himself capable of providing. He had come here to fix what he broke. He had spent 2 years following a search that his most trusted commander had been quietly steering. He had arrived 3 days ahead of a faction that had been 3 days behind his search the entire time because his search had been controlled by a man who knew its every movement. He had found her, and he had brought them directly to her. Kaylin, she said quietly. He turned his head toward her. His eyes were the silver pails she had looked at across a kitchen table less than an hour ago, and they held something she had not expected to see in them. Not anger, not calculation, but a raw and undefended recognition. He had done this, not with intent, not with cruelty, but the path from his original choice through to this specific dark riverbank with her children standing 20 feet behind her had been built incrementally from every decision he had made, including and especially the one he had made tonight by coming here first and preparing later. I'm sorry, he said. 2 words, same as in the garden 8 years ago. Different weight. He had more to be sorry for now, and he knew it, and the knowing was visible in a way the younger version of him would never have permitted. She didn't answer that. She turned back to Aldrich. The faction's sponsorship, she said. What does that require specifically? Aldrich looked at her with something close to surprise. He had expected, perhaps, that she would leave this to Kaylin. He had not accounted for 8 years of a woman who had stopped leaving things to anyone. A seat on the successor council for Vane's primary ally. Control of the children's formal introduction to the succession line. Approval rights on the healer's return to court, your return specifically, framed as the faction's reconciliation initiative. So they want credit, she said. They want leverage, Aldrich corrected. Credit is the surface of it. And if we refuse, the documentation goes out before morning. She stood on the dark river path and she did the thing she had been doing for 8 years, which was the thing her training had given her. She looked at the wound clearly, without flinching, and she assessed what was actually there rather than what she feared was there. The faction needed the children alive and presented as legitimate. That was not nothing. A faction that needed something alive and legitimized had constrained its own options considerably. The documentation threat was real, but it was also a detonation. Once used, it destroyed the leverage along with everything else. They would use it only if the alternative was complete loss of position, which meant there was a negotiation here. A narrow and dangerous one, on terms she had not chosen, in a location she had not selected, at a moment when her children were standing in the dark behind her, and the man beside her was only now understanding how completely he had been operated on by his own second-in-command. But there was a negotiation, and she had spent 8 years becoming very good at working within the constraints of what was actually available, rather than what she wished were available. She turned to Kalen. He was watching her with the full weight of his attention, and in it she could see him doing his own rapid recalculation, not of her, but of himself, of what role he was capable of playing here, and what role he had forfeited by coming unprepared. "Don't agree to anything," she said to him. "Not tonight, not under these conditions." "Seraphine, I mean it." She held his gaze. "You came here to fix what you broke. The first thing you need to fix is your instinct to decide first and consult after. Don't do it again tonight." He held for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, and she felt the specific weight of a very powerful man choosing to stand down from a position of reflex authority, which cost him something real, and which she gave him no credit for yet because one instance was not a pattern. She turned back to Aldrich. "Tell the faction we'll meet at dawn," she said. "Neutral ground. The village common house. No more than 4 representatives, no weapons drawn." She held his eyes. "And tell them that if anything touches my children between now and then, the negotiation ends and I burn every option to the ground rather than give them what they want. They can assess whether I mean that." Aldrich looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Kalen, who said nothing, which was either wisdom or deference, and in this particular moment amounted to the same thing. "I'll pass it along," Aldrich said. "Do that." She turned to her children. Rowan was watching her with the expression he'd worn when she told him the truth about his father at the kitchen table. Careful, committing, braced. Lyra was watching Aldrich with her silver-pale eyes and the stillness that processed everything and discarded nothing. Seraphine looked at her daughter's face and felt the full cold weight of what she was about to walk into at dawn. Not a healer negotiating on her family's behalf, but something the faction had not accounted for when they built their careful leverage. A woman who had spent 8 years learning exactly how much she could carry and had not yet found the limit. She had built her life on contingency and survival and the disciplined management of what she could not control. Tomorrow she would need to become something else entirely. Someone who did not manage the situation but broke its terms and rebuilt them from the inside. She was not certain she knew how to do that. She was more certain than she had ever been that she was about to find out. Dawn in Ashenvale came gray and cold, the light filtering through the mountain cloud cover without warmth. The kind of morning that offered visibility without comfort. Seraphine had not slept. She had spent the hours between the river path and first light sitting at Hessa's kitchen table with a cup of tea that went cold untouched, running the architecture of what was coming the way she ran the architecture of a difficult case, mapping the systems, identifying the pressure points, understanding where force would do damage and where it would simply deflect. Kalen had not slept either. She knew this because she could hear him through the wall of Hessa's second room, the particular quality of stillness that is not rest, but a man sitting with his own inventory. At some point before the cloud light began, she heard him move, once to the window, then back. She did not go to him. She was not ready to be in the same space as his particular brand of guilt, which was the large and genuine kind that, if she let it, would pull her attention away from the work she needed to do. The children slept. She had checked twice. Rowan on his back with one arm across his chest, Lyra curled on her side facing the wall, both of them with the deep unconsciousness of young bodies that had processed a significant amount of stress and cashed it out in sleep the way youth does. efficiently and without remainder. She looked at them for a long time in the dark before the light came. Then she went back to the table and finished mapping the architecture. The faction wanted leverage, Aldrich had said. Credit was the surface of it. She had been right that a faction which needed something alive and legitimized had constrained its own position, but she had spent the night finding the constraint's limit. The documentation threat was real. The release to rival territories and the dominion was real. But the faction's problem, the problem they had built into their own strategy without knowing it, was that leverage required a person who was afraid of losing what the leverage threatened. Seraphine had built her entire life on losing. She had walked out of a kingdom with 2 lives inside her and nothing else, and she had made everything she currently had from that 0 point. The faction's leverage assumed she would be protecting what she had built, the way people with something to lose protect it. She had something more important than that to protect. And the distinction between protecting a life and protecting children changed the calculation completely. At dawn, she walked to the common house alone. Kalen caught her at the door. He had heard her cross the main room and come after her, pulling on his coat, and he looked like what he was, a man who had been awake all night doing his own accounting. "I'm going with you," he said. "I know." She looked at him directly. "I need to say something first, and I need you to hear it without answering until I'm finished." He held. She took that as assent. "Last night I told you not to decide first and consult after. I meant it as a practical instruction for last night. What I need from you this morning is different. This morning I need you to understand that the faction's position is built on the assumption that you are the decision maker in this situation and that I am what you are protecting." She held his eyes. "I am not what you are protecting. I am the strategy. If you walk into that room and lead, they will negotiate with you and they will win because they have been operating you for 3 years and they know your patterns. If I lead, they have no patterns to use. They have only assessed me as the healer you were looking for, not as someone who has spent 8 years learning to function with nothing." She paused. "Can you do that?" The question cost her something to ask. She recognized in herself the old reflex, protect his authority, find a frame where this was collaboration rather than one person holding and one following, and she let it pass. She did not have the luxury of managing his ego this morning. More to the point, she did not think she needed to. He looked at her for a moment. The gray dawn light was not flattering to either of them. "Yes," he said, "I can do that. If I'm wrong, tell me. Quietly. Not in front of them." "Understood." She opened the door and went in. The common house was a long, low room with a stone floor and 2 trestle tables running its length. Someone had lit the iron stoves at either end, and the heat was building unevenly, warm near the stoves and still cold in the middle. 4 men sat on the far side of the left table. She had not met any of them before, but she assessed them in the first 3 seconds the way she had learned to assess a room when she walked into it. The one at the center left was the speaker. The one at the far right was the security. The 2 between them were there to fill out the appearance of a delegation. She sat across from them. Kalen sat beside her and did not speak, and she felt his wolf presence in the room shift slightly, a controlled backing down that was not submission, but careful management, and she was briefly and precisely grateful for it. The faction speaker was a man in his 50s with the kind of face that had learned to project calm as a professional tool. He introduced himself as Counselor Bravik. She did not recognize the name from Kalen's earlier briefing on the Vane faction, which meant either he was new or he had been careful enough to stay below the exposure line. "Healer Ashmore," he said, "we appreciate your willingness to meet." "Marin," she said, "I haven't used that name in 8 years. We should start with accuracy." Bravik's calm did not waver. "Marin, then. We believe this situation can be resolved in a way that benefits everyone present." "Tell me what you want," she said. "Not the version you told Aldrich, the actual version." A fractional pause. He had expected more preamble, more positioning. She had given him none, and the absence of it had knocked his opening slightly off its footing. "A formal acknowledgement from the Crown," he said, "that the children were located through the faction's investigative channels. A seat on the successor council for our representative. And your return to court framed as a reconciliation facilitated by the faction's intervention." "So you want to own this story," she said. "We want appropriate recognition of—" "You want to own this story. she said again, not louder, not harder, simply more precise. You want the official record to show that the children were found because of you, that the succession was stabilized because of you, and that the king's family was reunited because of you, so that when the Vane investigation reaches its final stage and the remaining faction members are assessed for complicity, the record shows your people as architects of reconciliation rather than architects of the original conspiracy. The room was quiet. The iron stove at the near end ticked and settled. Bravik looked at her with the first real attention he had paid her since she sat down. She was no longer the healer he had been told about. She was something he had not prepared a strategy for. That is a simplified version of the door of the common house opened. It was not Rowan. It was not Hessa. It was one of Kaelin's men, the tall one from the night before, and his face was wrong in the specific way that faces go wrong when the situation outside has changed faster than expected. My lord. His voice was controlled, but carrying an edge underneath it. The perimeter, they moved. Kaelin was on his feet before the sentence finished. Seraphine was a half-second behind him. The faction's 4 men did not move, and Bravik's calm had developed a quality she recognized with cold clarity. Not the calm of a man who was surprised, but the calm of a man who had been waiting for a specific thing to happen. This was a delay, she said. Bravik looked at her. The documentation has already been sent. It went out 2 hours ago. Whatever negotiation you were preparing to conduct here was not the actual decision point. The floor of the last 8 years conducted another rapid structural examination. She was outside before she finished the thought, Kaelin a step ahead of her, and the morning air hit her with the specific cold of mountains above the cloud line, and she was already reading the clearing, the tree line, the positions of the 2 men visible at the perimeter. 2, when there had been 4 last night, and understanding as she read them that the containment she had identified on the river path the night before had not been abandoned. It had been repositioned. They had the north and east. That much was clear from the movement in the tree line. How many was not clear yet? The river path, she said. They'll have it covered, Kaelin said. He was scanning the same tree line, and she could see him doing what she was doing, reading the available geometry, finding the options that remained. They let us use it last night because they wanted us inside the village perimeter, not outside it. Where are your men? 3 here, 2 were South Road. I don't know if South Road is still clear. She did the mathematics. 3 of his men against an unknown number of faction operatives who had spent 3 years being run by his own commander, who knew his defensive patterns and had spent the intervening hours repositioning while she sat in a common house with a man who was buying time. The children, she said. Hessa's house is set back from the tree line. I know where Hessa's house is. She was already moving, cutting across the clearing at an angle that kept the birch stand between her and the eastern tree line, and Kaelin was beside her because he had understood without discussion that the coordinate that mattered was not the faction's perimeter, but the specific location of 2 8-year-olds with extraordinary abilities and no combat training. They were 20 yards from Hessa's house when the gray wolf came out of the birch stand. Not Kaelin's wolf. Not any wolf she recognized. Larger than average, moving low and fast, and it was followed by 2 more behind it. Faction wolves, shifted and coordinated, covering the ground between the tree line and Hessa's house with a speed that shaved the remaining time to nothing. Kaelin shifted mid-stride. She had not seen him shift in 8 years, and the fact of it was still enormous. Not the shift itself, which was controlled and clean, but the wolf that emerged from it, which was massive and black, and moved with a precision that spoke of an alpha at the absolute peak of his capacity, running toward 3 opposing wolves without any of the hesitation she might have expected from a man who had spent the last 24 hours processing a series of foundational shocks to his understanding of his own life. He hit the lead faction wolf before it reached Hessa's door, and the impact was not graceful. It was force meeting force at full speed, and the sound of it crossed the clearing like a crack in stone. And Seraphine ran past all of it because there was nothing she could do for him in that register and everything she could do for what was inside the house. She hit the door, and it was not locked, and she was through it into the front room, and Rowan was there. He was standing in front of the closed rear door of Hessa's house with his wolf shimmer fully present, and this time it was not holding back. It was out, the gray wolf shimmer that had emerged at 5 to protect his sister, but built now on 3 years more of development, and the space around him had the quality she had felt once standing near a lightning strike. The air changed before the event, pressurized and specific, warning of something that had not yet fully arrived. "2 of them came through the back," he said. His voice was steady. She would think about that later, the particular steadiness of it, and not know what to do with the emotion it produced in her. I shut the door. Lyra's in the corner. "Step back from the door," she said. "Mom?" "Rowan, step back." He stepped back. The rear door held for 2 more seconds, and then it didn't, coming off its hinges the same way her kitchen door had come off its hinges the night before. And the 2 men who came through it were not wolves and were not subtle. They were men with the specific efficiency of operatives who had been given clear instructions and intended to execute them. She hit the first one with the locked wooden case before he fully cleared the frame. It was not a healer's action. It was the action of a woman who had spent 8 years understanding that the world will periodically require you to be something other than what you trained to be, and that the capacity for that shift was not a betrayal of your nature, but a necessary expansion of it. The case was solid oak with iron fittings. The man went down. The second man was larger and faster, and he had her wrist before she could reset. And then something happened that she had not planned for and would spend considerable time afterward trying to properly understand. Rowan's shimmer broke through, not partial, not the controlled flicker of a child managing an instinctive response. The gray wolf that had been building since the age of 5 emerged fully in the back room of Hessa's house. And it was not 5-year-old wolf, not even 8-year-old wolf. It was something that had apparently been waiting at the back of her son's capacity for some time, and had selected this particular moment to arrive completely. The operative holding her wrist looked at it and made the involuntary decision that every creature makes when confronted with something it recognizes as categorically beyond its ability to manage. He ran. The wolf did not pursue. It stood in the wrecked rear doorway with its 4 paws planted, and it made a sound that did not need translation. Then it turned, very slowly, and looked at Seraphine with Rowan's eyes, dark brown, warm, and at this specific moment carrying an expression that was unmistakably her son's, which was the expression of a person who had made a decision and was watching carefully to see what it had cost. "Rowan," she said. Her voice came out raw and specific and entirely honest. "Come back." The shift reversed. Her son was standing in the doorway in his worn wool shirt and his sleeping trousers and his bare feet on the stone floor. And he looked slightly surprised, the way he always looked slightly surprised after a major shift, as if the wolf's perspective and his own were not yet fully reconciled. "Is he okay?" Lyra said from the corner. She had not moved. She had both her knees drawn up and her arms around them, and she was watching her brother with the focused attention of a person who needed accurate data before they were going to produce an emotional response. "He's okay," Seraphine said. Then the sound from outside changed, not more, less. The specific subtraction of active conflict from a space, the way a room sounds different after a storm has moved through it rather than during. She went to the front window. Kalen was standing in the clearing. He had shifted back, and the coat he had been wearing was not salvageable, which registered in her mind as a small and absurd detail among larger ones. 3 faction wolves were on the ground in various states of incapacitation. 2 of his men had moved up to cover the tree line. The third had someone in a restraint hold at the edge of the clearing. Bravik, she thought, from the coat. He looked up and found the window and found her in it, and across the clearing and through the dirty glass she could see what the last 20 minutes had done to him. Not the physical damage, which was real and included a cut across his left collarbone that was going to need suturing, but something underneath that. The particular expression of a man who has spent the last 14 months searching and the last 8 hours being operated on and the last 20 minutes fighting for the specific thing he'd nearly made impossible to fight for and has now come to a still point and does not yet know what to do with the fact that he is still standing. She stepped back from the window. Her hands were shaking. She noted this with the clinical attention she gave her own physical responses in crisis, and she allowed it because her hands were allowed to shake when no one critical needed her to be steady. Both children were upright and undamaged, and her son had just fully manifested a wolf that was going to require considerable conversation, and her own right hand had a bruise forming where the operative had gripped her wrist, and none of this was the thing that was making her hands shake. What was making her hands shake was the understanding, arriving now that the immediate crisis had released pressure, that she had spent 8 years building an argument for why the distance was correct and necessary, and the only honest response to what had happened. And that argument was not wrong. It contained nothing false. The choice she had made had kept her children safe for 8 years, and the proof was that they were standing in this room. But the faction's documentation was already out. The rival territories and the Dominion had the information. The story of Seraphine Ashmore and the Alpha King's unacknowledged heirs was now a political fact in the world, not a secret she was managing. The distance she had maintained was no longer a protection she could offer. It had been taken from her at 2 in the morning by a man with a sealed courier and a 3-year head start. She could not protect them by staying away anymore. That option had been removed. The front door opened. Kalen came in, ducking the frame, still pulling his coat closed over the collarbone wound with the particular economy of a man managing pain on a schedule. He looked at Rowan, then at Lyra, then at Seraphine. "The faction's people are contained," he said. "Bravik is in custody. Aldrich—" He stopped. "Aldrich surrendered. He's outside." "The documentation," she said, "already sent. We can't recall it." His voice was flat and factual. "What we can do is get to the rival territories and the Dominion before they act on it. If I move fast enough with the right counter-documentation, the conspiracy evidence, the full record of what Vane's faction did, I can reframe the narrative before it calcifies." "How fast?" 3 days to the nearest territorial border, 5 to the Dominion." She looked at him. He was bleeding through the coat fabric at the collarbone, and his jaw had the bruised color of something that had been hit, and he was standing in a dead woman's house in a mountain village where he had broken 2 doors in 12 hours, and he was already thinking 3 moves ahead because that was what he did. And she felt the full complicated weight of the person he was. Not the king, not the man who had made the original choice, not the man who had been operated on for 3 years, but the specific human being who contained all of those things and was standing here still. "Then we need to move," she said. He held for a half second. "We." She looked at him. Then she looked at her children. Rowan, who was 8 years old and had his father's jaw, and had just protected his family with everything he had. Lyra, who had her father's eyes and her mother's stillness, and had sat in the corner gathering data through a crisis, and had not looked afraid, not once. "I told you last night," she said, "that I hadn't decided anything. I need you to understand that I'm still not deciding anything about you and me. That is a separate conversation, and it will happen on a separate timeline." "I understand. But the documentation is out, and my children are known, and Ashenvale can't protect them anymore." She picked up her locked case from the floor where it had fallen. The iron fittings were intact. "So, yes, we." She turned to her children. "Go get your coats," she said. "Both of you. Everything you need in one bag." Lyra unfolded from the corner and went without a word. Rowan started after her and then stopped the way he had stopped on the river path the night before and turned. He looked at Kalen. Kalen looked at him. It was not the look from the kitchen doorway, not the warning from a child protecting his mother. It was something else, something that had no clean name yet, that would need time and repetition and the accumulation of ordinary days before it became identifiable. Rowan said nothing. He went to get his coat. Kalen let out a breath so controlled it was barely audible. Outside, Seraphine heard one of his men give a sharp command. A sound from the road south, horses moving, and then a second voice answering, and then the particular silence of a situation that was not resolved but was no longer actively detonating. They had 3 days to the nearest territorial border, 5 to the Dominion. The faction's documentation was moving through courier systems right now, landing on the desks of men who would begin making calculations the moment they read it. She had spent 8 years in the mountains learning to move carefully and build slowly and protect what she had with precision and patience. That life was over. What came next would require something she had been assembling for 8 years without knowing she was assembling it. Not the healer, not the exile, not the woman who had left a garden gate with 2 lives inside her and nothing else. She shouldered her case and went to the door. Behind her, she heard Kalen pick something up from the floor. Her cold cup of tea from last night, she realized, setting it back on Hessa's table without being asked, without comment, The way a person does a small, ordinary thing in a space they are treating with care rather than assumption. She filed that. Then she opened the door and walked into the gray mountain morning. 3 days to the border. The story of her family was already moving through the world without her. She intended to move faster. They rode south out of Ashenvale as the cloud cover broke for the first time in 3 days, the mountain light coming through in long, cold shafts that lit the road without warming it. Seraphine rode with her case strapped behind her saddle and Lyra in front of her on the same horse, and Rowan rode beside Kaelin on a horse from Hessa's stable, which Hessa had offered without being asked, and which said everything about what kind of woman Hessa was, and what kind of 8 years Seraphine had spent in her company. They did not speak much on the first day. The road required attention, and the silence was not uncomfortable in the way silences are when people are avoiding something. It was the silence of people who have too much to say and are correctly identifying that the road south at speed is not the place to say it. Kaelin's collarbone wound had been sutured before they left. She had done it herself, in Hessa's kitchen, with the instruments from her case and the clean economy of a healer who has closed wounds in worse conditions. He had sat without complaint and watched her hands work with an attention she chose not to examine too closely. When she was finished, he had said thank you, with the directness of a man who meant the specific words and not the larger apology they sat inside. She had nodded and put her instruments back in their slots. The nearest territorial border was Grenfell, 3 days south. She had never been there. Kaelin knew its Lord Alpha by name and history, which was one of several things he had that she did not, and which she was willing to use without sentiment about the dynamic it represented. Pragmatism was not the same as concession. She had learned that in the second year in Ashenvale, when she had accepted help from the village elder, without it meaning she had given the elder authority over her decisions. On the second day's ride, Rowan pulled his horse up beside Kaelin's on a stretch of flat road where the pine forest opened and the riding was easy, and said, without preamble, "Tell me about the conspiracy." Kaelin looked at him. Rowan looked back with the expression Seraphine recognized as his working expression, collecting information, building structure. "Which part?" Kaelin said. "All of it. From the beginning. I want to understand how it worked." She watched Kaelin take this in. She watched him make the decision, visible in the set of his jaw and the slight adjustment of his posture, to answer the question as asked rather than to moderate it for an 8-year-old audience. It was the right choice. Rowan would have known immediately if the answer had been moderated, and it would have cost Kaelin more than the information would have. Kaelin told him. He told it straight and without editorializing, beginning with the Treasury manipulation 3 years prior and working forward through the intercepted message and the Velthari arrangement and Aldrich's role in the search. Rowan listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him. Lyra, in front of Seraphine, was listening too. She could feel the quality of her daughter's stillness shift from travel rest to active processing. When Kaelin finished, Rowan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You trusted the wrong people." "Yes." "For a long time." "Yes." Rowan looked at the road ahead. His horse kept pace without guidance, which was something it had been doing since the first hour. The animal had apparently assessed Rowan's balance and competence and made a decision to cooperate. "How do you know," Rowan said slowly, "who to trust next time? After something like that?" Kaelin was quiet long enough that it was a real pause and not a managed one. "You don't know," he said finally. "Not with certainty. What you can do is understand the mechanism that was used to fool you the first time so that you're harder to run the same way again." He paused. "And you pay attention to who tells you things you don't want to hear. People who benefit from your decisions tend to tell you what makes the decision easy. People who don't benefit have less reason to shape what they tell you." Rowan absorbed this. "That's why you listened to my mother last night, in the common house." "Partly." "What's the other part?" Kaelin looked at Seraphine briefly across the road between their horses, and the look was direct and undefended in a way that she received without being able to immediately categorize it. "The other part is that she was right, and I knew it before she finished the sentence." Rowan seemed to find this answer adequate. He rode quietly for another mile and then dropped back to check on something in his saddle pack, and the conversation closed the way his conversations tended to close, completely. Without trailing edge, the question answered and filed, and his attention already moving forward. Lyra turned her head slightly, not quite looking back at Seraphine. "He's going to ask that question a lot," she said quietly. "Different versions of it." "I know," Seraphine said. "Is that okay?" "It's necessary," she said, "which is better than okay." Lyra settled back against her. After a moment, she said, even quieter, "Are you scared?" Seraphine considered the honest answer. She had been giving her children honest answers for 8 years because the alternative created a specific kind of damage she had observed in children whose parents had sheltered them from accurate information, a brittleness, an inability to process difficulty because they had never been given the tools. She was not going to stop now because the honest answer was complicated. "Yes," she said, "of some things. Not the faction and not the rival territories. Those are problems with solutions, and I know how to work problems with solutions." "Then what?" She looked at the road ahead, at Kalen's back, at the way he rode, upright and easy, the posture of a man who had been on horseback since he was young and had never needed to think about it. At Rowan riding beside him now again, having migrated back during her conversation with Lyra, the two of them side by side on the road with the same set to their shoulders that she had seen every morning in the mirror for 8 years, looking out at her from her son's frame. "Getting it right," she said. "The next part. There's no map for it." Lyra was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "We're good at things without maps." Seraphine tightened her arms slightly around her daughter's waist. She did not say anything. There was nothing to add. They reached Grenfell on the 3rd afternoon. Lord Alpha Cassian of Grenfell was a compact, direct man in his mid-40s who had governed his territory for 20 years with the pragmatic competence of someone who understood that governance was primarily a logistics problem and should be treated as such. He received them in his working hall rather than his formal one, which Seraphine read as a deliberate signal. This was a conversation, not a ceremony. He looked at the children with the assessing attention of a man who had been briefed on what the faction's documentation claimed and was conducting his own independent evaluation. Rowan met the assessment without flinching. Lyra did not meet it at all. She looked at the room instead, cataloging it with the focused attention she gave to spaces she was deciding how to feel about. Cassian looked at Seraphine. "You're the healer?" he said. "Yes." "The documentation that reached me yesterday characterizes this situation as a concealed succession and a destabilized crown." He said it without editorializing. "I'm giving you the opportunity to characterize it differently." She sat across the working table from him, and she told it. Not the version that made Kalen's choices forgivable first, and hers reasonable second. The version that was true, which contained both of their failures and the failure of the systems around them, and the specific actors who had operated those systems for their own purposes. She told it as a healer tells a case history, precisely in the order it occurred, without omitting the parts that were uncomfortable. Cassian listened without interrupting. His second, seated at the corner of the table, took notes. When she finished, Cassian looked at Kalen. "You have the conspiracy documentation." "With my courier. It arrived this morning." Kalen set the sealed packet on the table. Every record of Vane's manipulation, the treasury accounts, the intercepted communications, Aldrich's full confession given voluntarily at Ashenvale. The Successor Council has the original documentation. These are certified copies. Cassian picked up the packet. He did not open it immediately. He looked at it with the expression of a man deciding how much weight he was prepared to put on a structure before he tested it. "The Dominion is the harder conversation," he said. "Lady Mira's family will want direct communication from the Crown, not documentation." "I'll go to the Dominion myself," Kalen said, "with full record and without intermediaries." "That will take time." "Yes." Cassian set the packet down. He looked at the children again. Rowan, who had been sitting with his forearms on his knees and his eyes moving between the adults in the room with the alert patience of someone following a negotiation he intended to fully understand. Lyra, who had apparently decided the room was acceptable and had shifted her attention to the working table's surface, where a large territory map was spread and weighted at the corners. "The girl is reading the map," Cassian said. She does that, Seraphine said. Lyra looked up. She held Cassian's gaze with the directness of a child who had not been taught deference as a reflex. The Grenfell-Velthari border crossing is marked wrong, she said. The Eastern Pass is 2 miles further north than this shows. Cassian looked at his second. His second looked at the map. A pause. She's correct, the second said. The survey from 8 years ago had an error. We've known, but haven't updated the working copies. Cassian looked at Lyra for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating. Then he looked at Seraphine. I'll communicate to the rival territories that the documentation was politically motivated and that my investigation found it unsupported by direct evidence. He picked up the packet. This will help. It was not a complete resolution. It was a first stone in a longer road, which was exactly what she had understood it would be when she had said we in Hessa's front room and shouldered her case. She had not expected a rival. She had expected the beginning of forward motion, and that was what this was. They stayed in Grenfell 2 nights. The second night, after the children were asleep in the rooms Cassian's household had provided, Seraphine sat in the small courtyard at the center of the guest quarters where a fire had been lit and was burning low, and Kaelin came and sat across from her. They had not been alone since the kitchen in Ashenvale. He sat down and did not speak immediately, which she had come to understand was not discomfort, but the specific patience of a man who had learned, recently and at cost, that speaking first was not always the same as leading well. She looked at the fire, and she let the silence sit for a while. Aldrich, she said eventually. He'll be brought to the capital for formal proceedings. His voice carried no pleasure in this, only the flat specific weight of a man accounting for damage he had not seen coming from a direction he had trusted completely. 12 years, I gave him everything, rank, access, the inside of every decision I made. I know. I should have... He stopped. She waited. There were signs. Looking back, they're obvious. At the time I read them as loyalty, and I read them that way because I wanted them to be loyalty. He looked at the fire. I built a picture of the people around me that was mostly accurate, and then I used that mostly accurate picture to explain away the parts that didn't fit. It's not stupidity. It's something worse than stupidity. It's a kind of comfort that turns into a vulnerability. She looked at him. He was not asking for absolution. He was conducting an audit in her presence, which was different, and which cost him something that she could see in the careful steadiness of his voice. The thing about being betrayed by someone close, she said slowly, is that it doesn't just damage the specific relationship, it damages the methodology, how you read people, how you extend trust. You start to question the instrument rather than the individual result, and if you question it long enough, you stop using it. She paused. That's the real harm, not the individual traitor, the after effect on your capacity to trust anything. He looked at her. How did you not... He stopped. How did I not let it do that to me? Yes. She thought about it honestly, rather than reaching for the answer that would sound most composed. I had to trust people, she said. Practically. I needed the midwife and Hessa and the village elder and the circuit traders who moved supplies. I couldn't afford to let one betrayal calcify into a general position because the children needed a mother who could still ask for help. She looked at the fire. It's not that I figured out something wise. It's that I didn't have the option of being broken for very long. He was quiet for a moment. Rowan asked me today how you know who to trust after something like this. I heard. I gave him a technical answer. It was a good answer. The real answer, he said, is that you don't stop. You get better at reading the signals, but you don't stop extending trust because the alternative is something you can't govern from. You can't build anything from complete closure. He paused. I understood that abstractly. I'm only now understanding it in the way that changes how you move. The fire ticked and settled. The courtyard was cold and the warmth from the fire reached about 4 feet and no further. Somewhere in the guest quarters, she could hear the low sound of the household settling toward night. I need to say something, Kaelin said. And I need to say it once, cleanly, and not repeat it because repeating it turns it into pressure. She looked at him. I am not asking you to forgive me on a schedule, he said. I am not asking you to return to a role or a title or a position in relation to mine. I am asking, he stopped, rebuilt the sentence. I would like the opportunity to be known by my children over time, whatever form that takes, whatever pace that requires. And I would like another stop. His jaw was set in the way she had catalogued 8 years ago and could still read precisely. I would like to be in proximity to you long enough that you can make an assessment of who I am now rather than only who I was. That's all. That's the whole of what I'm asking. She held it. She did not answer immediately because it deserved the weight of a real response rather than a managed one. Those are not small things, she said finally. No. You understand that the children make their own decisions about you, about what they want that to mean. I understand that. And you understand that I am not the same person who stood at a garden gate 8 years ago, and that whoever I am now is not a position relative to you. I am not the Luna apparent of anything. I am a healer who rebuilt her life from a 0 point, and I intend to continue being that regardless of whatever else is true. I would not ask you to be anything else, he said. I don't think... He looked at her directly. I don't think I understood 8 years ago what I had in front of me. I understood comfort and presence and the specific relief of someone in my orbit who didn't want something from me. I didn't understand what you were. I do now. And I'm not asking you to diminish any of it. She looked at him for a long moment. The fire was low enough now that the light was mostly orange, and the shadows were significant, and she could see him clearly anyway, which said something about how carefully she had been looking. Proximity, she said. That's what you said. Yes. Then proximity, she said. We'll see what that means as we go. He nodded. Once. The way he had nodded on the mountain road when she told him not to decide first and consult after. The specific nod of a man making a commitment he intended to honor rather than performing agreement. She had been watching for the difference between those two things for 3 days, and she had found it consistently, and she filed that without conclusion. They sat with the low fire for another half hour, not talking. It was not the silence of avoidance. It was the silence of two people who had said what needed saying and were sitting inside the aftermath of it, letting it settle at its own pace rather than filling the space with noise. The Dominion took 10 more days. Kalen went with his documentation and his courier and the full record of the conspiracy, and he came back with a formal accord from the Velthari family, not warm, not without cost, but concluded. Lady Mira, it turned out, had sent her own letter of support. She had written that she had known from the beginning that the arrangement was political, that she bore no grievance, and that the instability created by the faction's actions had cost the Dominion as much as it had cost Shadowcrest, and she had her own interest in seeing it addressed. The letter was direct and practical, and Seraphine read it and thought that under different circumstances she might have liked Lady Mira considerably. The return to Shadowcrest happened in stages. Not a procession, not a ceremony of arrival. They came back along the southern road on an overcast afternoon, and the first people to see them were the stable hands and the groundskeeper, neither of whom had been briefed. And the groundskeeper looked at the two children and looked at the king and made the calculation that was available from the evidence and said nothing and went back to his work, which was the most dignified response possible and which Seraphine appreciated. The formal public accounting came 3 weeks after their return. Kalen stood before the assembled court and the representative council, and he told the story of the conspiracy without softening his own role in it. He named Vane and his faction and presented every document. He named Aldrich and described the 12 years of trusted proximity that had been used as the mechanism of deception. He did not ask for sympathy or frame any of it in terms designed to minimize his part. Then he named his children. He spoke their names in the full formal construction, Rowan and Lyra, heirs to Shadowcrest. And he named their mother and restored every title the Ashmore family had held, and several that had never been extended to her, including one that had no precedent in the court's records because it had never previously been needed. Independent counsel to the Crown on matters of pack welfare and territorial health. A position with its own seat on the Advisory Council and its own authority. Seraphine sat in the gallery above the council floor during the announcement. She had not asked for the gallery. She had been given it by the court chamberlain as the obvious location for someone who was not yet formally positioned, and she had accepted it because high ground was useful for reading a room, and she had not stopped being practical. She watched the court's face during the announcement. She watched the ones who applauded because they were reading the political landscape and understood what position was now most advantageous. She watched the smaller number who applauded because the thing being announced seemed genuinely right to them. She could not be certain about the latter category. She had no clean way to distinguish the authentic from the calculated at this distance. She filed this under things she would continue assessing. Rowan sat beside her in the gallery and watched his father speak with the specific attention he had given to Kaylin's answer on the road to Grenfell. At the moment Kaylin spoke their names, Rowan's jaw went very still in the way that meant he was holding his own response carefully, managing something that was not ready to be expressed yet. She put her hand briefly on his, and he did not pull away. Lyra sat on her other side and watched the room below with her silver pale eyes, and did not watch her father particularly until after he had finished speaking. And then she tracked him as he stepped back from the speaking position and moved to his chair at the head of the council table. And she watched the way he moved through the room, not performing, just moving, the way a man moves in a space when he is not trying to make an impression, but is simply getting from one place to another. He looked at the gallery, Lyra said quietly. Once, right at the beginning. I know, Seraphine said. Lyra looked up at her. Did you look back? A pause. Yes. Her daughter considered this. Good, she said, with the settled finality of someone who had reached a conclusion through their own methodology and was satisfied with it. The conspiracy trials ran through the autumn. Vane was stripped of all territory and title and sent to the northern outpost assignment that various people in the court's history had been sent to for various forms of permanent removal from proximity to power. His allies received proportional accounting. Aldrich stood trial separately, and his sentencing was the hardest day of that entire season, not because the outcome was uncertain, but because 12 years of genuine service existed alongside the 3 years of betrayal, and the court had to hold both truths simultaneously, and watching a structure try to hold two contradictory truths at once without collapsing was a precise and uncomfortable thing. Kaylin did not ask her how she thought the Aldrich trial should go. He asked his counsel and his legal advisors and the representatives of the affected parties. She noted this. He was learning which questions to ask of whom, which was not the same as learning everything, but was the foundation that everything else was built on. Rowan asked to attend one session of the conspiracy trials. She said yes. He sat in the observer section and watched 4 hours of formal proceedings with the focused absorption of a student, and afterward, walking back through the castle corridors, he said, "A lot of it was small decisions that seemed reasonable at the time." "Yes," she said. "Each one alone didn't look like the full thing." "That's how it works," she said. "That's how most of the large damage gets done. Not in one obvious choice, but in the accumulation of smaller ones that each had a justification." He was quiet for a moment, walking. "How do you stop it?" "You ask the second question," she said. "The first question is whether this decision is reasonable. The second question is where this decision leads if you keep making it in the same direction." He nodded, the same way his father nodded. The committee nod, not the managing one. She did not tell him she had noticed the similarity. She let it be simply true. By winter, Rowan had developed a relationship with Kaylin that she could not have designed and would not have tried to. It was built from the road to Grenfell and from questions asked and answered without managing, and from the specific discovery that his father would tell him hard truths in a form he could use rather than soft versions designed to make the relationship easier. It was not the relationship of a boy and the father he had always known. It had too much history and too much interruption for that. It was something that had its own shape, built from the actual materials available, and that shape was real in a way that borrowed shapes never are. Lyra took longer. Lyra's accounting ran deeper and slower, and she was still running it at winter's end when the snow came to the capital, and the court settled into the particular rhythm of a cold season. She came to Kaylin's council sessions on 3 separate occasions without being asked, sitting in the observer position and watching him work. And she came back to their quarters afterward and reported her observations to Seraphine with the clinical detail of someone collecting evidence. Seraphine did not tell her what conclusions to draw. She waited. In early spring, Lyra brought her father the corrected border survey for Grenfell. She had done it herself, working from the error she had spotted in the working map and cross-referencing with 3 other documents she had pulled from the council library. It was accurate, and it was formatted correctly in the official style, and she set it on his working desk without ceremony and said it needed to be updated in all the working copies before the spring territorial meetings. He looked at it. He looked at her. He said, "Thank you." She said, it was wrong. Someone should fix it." She left, but she came back the following week with another correction to another document, and the week after that. And by the time the spring territorial meetings arrived, there was a specific desk in the council library that had become associated with Lyra's presence in the afternoons, and the council librarian had begun leaving certain documents on it with the quiet efficiency of a man who had identified a useful resource and was making practical use of it. Seraphine built her practice in the city, not inside the castle walls. That had been Kaylin's first instinct, and she had declined it clearly. She built it in the merchant quarter where the population was dense and the need was constant, and she was not the castle healer attached to the court structure, but the healer who was available to the people who couldn't easily reach the castle. The advisory seat was real, and she used it, and it had teeth in the specific form of a vote on welfare matters that was not subject to the king's override, which had been the condition she had named and which he had agreed to without negotiation, because he understood it was not a condition designed to limit him, but to ensure she was present as herself and not as an extension of his authority. She walked to the castle some evenings. Not every evening. On the evening she came, she and Kaylin sat in the same working room where he reviewed the day's council documents, and she read the welfare reports from the outer territories. And sometimes they talked about what they were reading, and sometimes they sat in the same room and worked in parallel without talking, and both things were useful in their own way. She did not call it anything yet. She was not ready to name it, and she was not going to name it before it was ready to be named, and Kaylin had not asked her to, which was the specific grace she had not expected from him, and which she was learning to receive without immediately assessing what it cost him. The spring the twins turned 9, Rowan ran the full-pack trial for the first time. He had asked to be assessed formally rather than waiting for the standard age, and the assessment council had been uncertain, and Seraphine had sat in on the deliberation not to advocate but to observe, and what she had observed was that 3 of the 5 council members wanted to refuse because of uncertainty about precedent, and 2 wanted to refuse because they were uncertain about the result, and those were different problems, and only one of them was legitimate. He passed. Not barely, completely, in a way that produced silence from the assessment panel and then a specific kind of conversation among them that she recognized as a room recalibrating its expectations. Lyra did not ask to be assessed early. She had her own timeline, and she was running it. Standing in the corridor outside the assessment chamber on Rowan's trial day, waiting for the panel to finish their deliberation, Seraphine felt Kaylin come to stand beside her. He had been inside the chamber as observer, his right, as king, to observe any formal assessment. He had not intervened at any point. She knew this because Rowan had told her afterward, and Rowan's account of events was precise. They stood in the corridor. The deliberation sounds came through the door, muffled, and the afternoon light from the corridor's narrow windows laid pale rectangles across the stone floor. "He was extraordinary," Kaylin said. Not pride in the self-congratulatory sense. Something more complicated. Something that knew it had no right to claim credit, and was not claiming it, and was feeling the weight of the result anyway. "He's been extraordinary," she said. "The assessment just made it visible to people who hadn't been paying attention." He looked at her. "I know that." "I know you do." A pause. The deliberation continued behind the door. The afternoon light shifted slightly as a cloud moved. "Seraphine," he said. She looked at him. "I know I have not earned the full account of what the last 8 years cost you. I know I can't earn that. Some things don't have an earning mechanism." His voice was even and direct, and carried the specific weight of a man who had spent a winter thinking clearly about what he was and was not capable of claiming. "What I can tell you is that there is not a day that goes by in this kingdom, since I found out what I had and what I had lost, that I have not understood the full weight of it, not the political cost, not the succession liability, the actual weight of what those years were." He paused. "I want you to know that, not so that it changes anything, so that you know it's true." She looked at him for a long moment. The door opened. Rowan came out with the particular walk of a person who has passed something difficult and is not yet permitting himself to react fully to the fact. He looked at both of them in the corridor together, and he stopped. He looked at his father. He looked at his mother. Something moved across his 8-year-old face that was none of the things she had catalogued. Not Rowan's working face, or his warning face, or his committing face. Something new. Something that had no name yet because it had only just become possible. He crossed the corridor and he stood between them, not choosing a side, equidistant, and he looked up at both of them with the direct, uncomplicated attention he gave to things he had decided about. They said yes, he said. We know, Kaylin said. Okay, Rowan said, and he put one hand in his mother's and he looked at his father with the expression that would need years to fully develop into what it was going to be. And Kaylin met it without managing it, without performing anything, with only the specific quality of a man who had learned through the most expensive possible education that presence was not the same as power, and that showing up completely was the only thing that could not be faked. Seraphine stood in the corridor with her son's hand in hers, and the spring light on the stone floor, and the full weight of the last 9 years inside her chest. Not lighter than it had been, not erased, but set alongside other things now, other weights that were warmer. She understood that this was not the ending she would have written from the garden gate at the beginning. She had walked away from that gate with 2 lives inside her and the specific intention of building something new from zero, and she had built it. And what she had built had not been dismantled by everything that followed. It had been added to, expanded by the very disruption that she had feared would collapse it. The rebuilding was not completion. It was not restoration of what had been. It was something that had its own shape, fitted to the actual people they had all become, rather than the people they might have been in a cleaner story. She had spent 8 years learning to move forward under conditions that did not improve. She could do the rest of this under conditions that, slowly and imperfectly, and with the full ordinary difficulty of real things, were beginning to. That was enough. That was, she understood now, what enough actually meant. Not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of something worth moving toward inside it. She held her son's hand. The spring light held on the corridor floor. Behind her, the kingdom they were going to build from the wreckage of the old one waited, patient as stone, for them to come back to the work. They went.